I'm Sue Rabati, and I'm the Executive Director of DES Action USA, and we're here to talk about DES population health tragedy. Before we get started, I want to thank the Maternal and Child Health in Action, BU School of Public Health, and the Group on Reproductive Health and Rights for your help, and the two student volunteers, Whitney Renshoff and Stephanie Ellman. So thank you. So we have some great speakers here today for you to talk about the history of DES, which is a synthetic version of estrogen, and the ongoing research into it. But the first question I would ask myself sitting here is, why should students today and watching this in the future care about a drug that was given to women 50 or 60 years ago? In fact, if it was anyone in your family was given it, it would have been your grandmother or your great-grandmother. And how could that possibly make a difference to you today? And there's two answers. The short answer is, as an endocrine disruptor, if it was given to your grandmother or your great-grandmother, it can pass through the generations. You'll hear more about how that happens. And it would make you a DES grandchild or great-grandchild. It can, we don't know exactly what that means, but the first couple of generations found different types of cancers, breast cancers and cervical cancers and vaginal cancers. They found tumors in the sons and a lot of infertility issues. And if that's going to be in your future, the more you know about it, the more you can prepare, the more you can watch for it. And maybe it's not. I mean, it's going to be something that we just are never going to know the full answer to. I think our research is going to tell us that. So the long answer to my question, the second answer, is that DES is not the only drug that was given to the public without careful testing. This was given to the public with just bad science behind it. But it's not the only drug that doctors have prescribed without telling patients that they don't know that it's truly effective. They don't know what the long-term effects are. They've never been studied. They weren't studied before the drug was given out. In all the roles that you're going to have in your life, as patient, as parent, as caregiver, as spouse, you need to understand the drugs are not tested well. Some are, but you have to assume that they're not. Before they're released to the public, they're tested by the FDA for efficacy and for safety, but that's all very short term. It's generally over a series of months or a year or so. The long-term effects and the myriad of drug interactions available to it, and the subgroups, women and ethnic groups, just don't get covered in many of these studies. So you need to consider carefully any drug you take before you take it, and consider the alternatives. You want to make sure you're getting full benefit before you take the risk. The first speaker, now that I've lectured you, is Carrie Christensen, who is a past board president of DES Action. She's been an activist for more than 35 years. Mm-hmm. That's a long time. She's a used to think like
I'm old.
This is old. She's a DES daughter herself, and is on the Partners Committee at the National Institutes of Environmental Health. Carrie's a member of the steering committee for the NIH National Cancer Institute's DES follow-up study. She's ready to tell us about the early days of DES and why DES Action started from the kitchen table and grew into a national movement. Thank you.
We'll do it that way. On the slide behind me, you will see that button, Ask Your Mother, and indeed that's one of the first buttons that DES Action ever produced. And the idea was, as Sue was talking about generationally, what we know now more, starting in the late 70s and, well, from 1971 on, until DES Action was organized, we didn't have a way of identifying one another. Our mothers didn't have a way of identifying themselves even as DES mothers. So we started making buttons, and that's what it did. But probably more importantly, as why a button was needed, is what is DES? Next slide. In 1938, DES was developed in England as the first synthetic estrogen, but DES was not patented Between 1919 and 1949, the chemical products produced in Britain that were funded by the government were excluded from patent protection because they wanted to counter the threat posed by the much stronger and superior German pharmaceutical chemical industry. So that's why anything that was developed like DES and DODS was given free, and the formula given free to anyone. And DES, unfortunately, was cheap and easy to produce. DES was not developed for use during pregnancy. It was meant only for short-term use for menopause symptoms. Dr. Dodds, who developed it, was always rather opposed and really mortified that DES was given for anything else. Next slide. In 1941, the FDA in the United States did approve DES in tablets up to 5 milligrams. It was approved for vaginitis, for those menopausal symptoms that it was developed for as far as DODS was concerned, and postpartum lactation suppression to prevent breast engorgement. From the start of DODS discovery, however, there was concern that DES did cause cancer in laboratory animals. However, once the Food and Drug Administration approved DES, it was available for off-label uses, and that's what happened. Until 1947, or including 1947, when the FDA did approve DES for use as a miscarriage preventative. Now, the reason that happened is that there were two professors, a husband and wife team at Harvard, George and Olive Smith, who had decided or determined that high doses of DES would prevent miscarriage. Their hypothesis was that it wasn't the DES itself that was preventing a miscarriage, it was that it was stimulating the pregnant woman's body to produce more of her own estrogen and progesterone. The Smith and Smith, when we talk about high doses, we're really talking about high doses of DES. Their recommendation for DES dosage escalated throughout the pregnancy, starting with 5 milligrams daily and increasing every 2 weeks by 5 milligrams until reaching 125 milligrams daily in the 8th month. Pregnant women who followed this dosage schedule ingested more than 10 grams, and I've heard today even more than 12 grams of DES. And compare that to what's in a birth control pill today of estrogen, 20 to 50 micrograms. So, huge amount. Because of this research that the Smiths had done, and we'll talk about that a little bit on the next slide, the drug companies used their studies to convince doctors to prescribe DES to their pregnant patients. Up to 5 million pregnant women during that time of initial approval and beyond through 1971 were given DES and delivered. So there are an estimated 5 to 10 million DES mothers, DES daughters, and DES sons in the United States alone. And we don't know about grandchildren or future generations beyond that.
Slide.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, yeah, next slide. In 1953, a doctor in Chicago conducted the first controlled, randomized, double-blind, all of those words are important, study on DES use in pregnancy and found that it was not effective for preventing miscarriage. At the same time as he was doing that study, there were animal studies being published that indeed DES was carcinogenic and could disturb the development of the embryo or fetus. Later, 25 years later, Diekman's 1953 research was reanalyzed and showed that DES actually increased the risks for miscarriages, premature births, and perinatal death. We'll hear more about that later, too. However, the Smiths, next slide, really were frustrated that Diekman had published this, and so they went on the counterattack and saying, no, DES is very effective. And so their article was prophylactic hormone therapy. The interesting thing with the research that they had done is that, and while they say DES was to be administered in selected cases, meaning women who'd had miscarriage, those aren't the women that they used for their studies. They used women in their first pregnancies because they said there's a high incidence of late pregnancy complications, and that they thought the DES would help that. Without having the layers of, oh, there may be something else wrong with the women. Structurally, let's just do first pregnancies and see what happens. So even then, even in their own research, DES didn't really prevent or stall premature delivery. But the babies born, at least according to the Smiths, were fatter and longer. And that meant that they didn't qualify as premature under the scales that were being used at that time to identify premature birth, even though it was in the months of the time, or lacking weeks before delivery, the babies were bigger and fatter. So, there you go, yet again. DES was also available in other forms. Mostly it was in the pill form, but it was also in shots, suppositories, and mixed with prenatal vitamins. So DES was manufactured by over 200 drug companies in the United States alone. So from 1954 on, DES continued to be prescribed to pregnant women. In 1971, however, there was an article by Arthur Herbst and his colleagues that linked DES exposure to a vaginal cancer, a rare vaginal cancer, at least rare for girls and young women, clear cell adenocarcinoma. These young women had presented kind of in a cluster, particularly in this area in Boston, and found that the cancer that was found was one that usually only occurred in postmenopausal women. It was one mother who asked whether the DES she was prescribed during her pregnancy could have caused her daughter's cancer, and the connection was made. It also is a connection to familial guilt around DES, by the way, which is another part of this family dynamic that we're having. So on the basis of the Herbst study in 1971, the FDA issued a drug bulletin to physicians stating that DES was contraindicated for use during pregnancy. But the FDA did not ban DES. It only urged doctors to stop using it for their pregnant patients. Most, but not all, stopped, meaning that there were prescriptions for DES given to pregnant women through the early 1980s in the United States, and even longer internationally. Next slide. Because of all of this, trying to figure out how many people were exposed, who was there, DES were hearings on Capitol Hill. And about the regulation of DES, it's used for humans and in animal feed. One of the other uses of DES is that it was extensively used as a growth stimulant in chickens until 1959. Oddly, it was banned then for chickens and not for anything else. And in beef. And in beef, the DES was not taken off the list of approved hormonal growth stimulants for cattle until 1979. But in addition to all of these other uses, both the approved ones that we've had before, that now were contraindicated for some of them, the DES was given to stop growth height. You may have heard of the tall girls in Australia. There are tall girls in the United States too. It was used for treatment of advanced breast cancer in postmenopausal women, and as an emergency postcoital contraceptive. It was one of the most popular contraceptives on college campuses in their health services for a good long time. Researchers that were studying DES daughters in those early years were finding things beyond the concern about the clear cell adenocarcinoma. They were finding and seeing significant abnormalities in the reproductive organs, infertility, and problems with pregnancy. In 1975, the National Cancer Institute, and this is the next slide, began the DES Adenosis Project, the DESAD project, and it was the first government-sponsored study looking at this. The really important thing about this study, which began so early, is that it was record review and matched unexposed participants that were enrolled in 5 centers around the country. But what was helpful for the consumer, and while this was very helpful for the consumer, where we as those of us who are exposed were looking is where can we find information. And grassroots women's health organizations in Berkeley and in Cambridge published the first consumer information about the harm caused by prenatal DES exposure. And it really was to serve the needs of the DES mothers and daughters who were starting to seek more information. And unfortunately, their doctors had little or no information about DES exposure. Some of these DES mothers and daughters met in 1977, but next slide, in 1978, DES was founded with the support of many of the other activists from other women's health issues. DES Action was founded by DES mothers and DES daughters. From the beginning, the organization sought to identify, educate, empower, and advocate for DES-exposed individuals. The mission statement really didn't change that whole time. But we really were organized, and the reason for organizing was primarily to gather together to share information, whether it be peer support information about what we were going through, and where you had a doctor who was willing to talk to you and even listen that you might be DES exposed. How do you find medical records? All of the things that at that time was the great unknown. We didn't know the extent of the health issues that would be involved with DES exposure, but we were pretty concerned because a lot of us were going through a lot of different kinds of surgeries and clinics and doctors, and everybody saying, I've never seen anything like that before. So not many of those clinics had information for us, so we decided we needed to seek out our own. Next slide. Throughout the 1980s in organizing DES Action, we really worked on a state-by-state basis. We tried to organize groups in each state, in part because of the support system that you could have, but also to try and work with our state health departments to develop some kind of, whether it be a one-pager about information about DES that could go to the doctors. As a nonprofit, even then, and maybe especially then, or always then, the health information or questions about health are not accepted from a nonprofit organization by the medical community. And so we were always looking to have partners that would help us share that story, not only about what we were going through, but about what they needed to know. Some of the other things is we worked on legislation prohibiting insurance discrimination for those they wanted to call DES a pre-existing condition, and we said, well, wait a minute, we're not sick, we're injured, that's a difference. And happily, because it was passed in those 8 states, it became pretty much the law of the land. We started printing a lot of brochures and offering in-services ourselves to clinics with information we'd gathered and with the work that we were doing with some really good medical advocates that we had. DES Awareness Week was established. We sent a representative to the UN Decade of Women Conference in Nairobi because we recognized from the beginning DES had been manufactured throughout the world and available throughout the world. And so there were many countries that were affected by this. We did our own health history survey, collecting anecdotal information, wanting to be able to share our stories about what was happening and kind of glean that information together. It was put together by an epidemiologist who was a DES daughter, and we shared it with the researchers at the NIEHS. and National Cancer Institute specifically. International groups formed out of those, that Nairobi conference. And we had a research conference, and this was in 1989, the symposium Looking Back, Looking Forward. At the time, there was concern that funding for the DESAD project would be cut or limited. And so because of that meeting and the conversations we were having and concern about what's going to happen if we don't have a national research program, DES Action changed from being a state-by-state organization and focused its activities on the national health policy affecting DES-exposed information. Next slide. So the culmination of that for us was that in 1992, the DES Education and Research Amendments were passed, and they mandated a national program of research, outreach, and education of the public and health professionals about DES. Now you may ask why. In many ways, if there's anything that has been lucky for the DES population, it was the fact that we had been studied since 1975 and that we were advocating in the early 90s that we needed to have more research. In 1990, the National Institutes of Health established the Office of Research on Women's Health to promote women's health research within the NIEHS, after it was determined that there were very few studies that involved women at all. And maybe still a problem. The DESAD project was one of the few that they could identify with a focus on a women's health issue because 75% or 3/4 of the DES population they were studying were women. They were indeed studying DES sons, but in much of the focus of what we have and what we know has always been on DES daughters. So the NIEHS received funding because of the amendments that were passed. And the DES follow-up study was established combining the DESAD project and cohorts from other studies that had been going on. Next slide. So in the 90s, also because of the pilot projects with the research and being taken care of at the National Cancer Institute and NIEHS also, pilot projects to develop education campaigns were done. And so they started, DES Action was fortunate in that we were invited to participate in all of the pilot projects, and I would say from 1992 on, DES Action was invited to participate in every aspect of research and conversation and development of any educational materials. It changed. DES changed how consumers had access to all of the people that normally we didn't, whether it be in the government, and in research, and having those conversations and being a seat at that table. Next slide. The Food and Drug Administration finally withdrew approval of DES for human use in 2000. And it took a good long time, despite all of the problems. The last and largest manufacturer of DES was Eli Lilly, and they had stopped producing it in 1997 for human use. It continued, however, for use, and still is available for use in some animals. Incontinence for dogs being the one that I think of is still being used. But if you go online, you will see that DES is available at compounding pharmacies. And I have talked with the FDA about that, and they say that shouldn't happen. And I said, it is happening, and here's where you find it. So, but indeed it goes on. DES Action participated in colloquiums around the 30 years of DES, discovery, education, and science. And this is when we became involved in the start of the NIEHS partners. as working and joining with other consumer organizations that had research going on at NIEHS that affected us and our populations and affected the future health. And so we have met on a regular basis since 2001 to hear from researchers and to meet with the director. One of the interesting things, and I think particularly we want to be aware of this all, DES is, we're talking about our prenatally exposed or generationally exposed population, and Sue was talking about other things. But DES has been a real marker in understanding endocrine disruption as a whole, whether it be in the environment, in the animal models, in anything else. And so when we have wanted to learn more about that, one of the baselines that any lab can do is try giving DES in a dosage that they think and see how it compares to what they're finding in the environment. And that's how they particularly started. So it's been an interesting, and so that what keeps us going into NIEHS in particular. The CDC's DES update was launched in 2003, and we consider that a win for our organization too. Not only were we involved in the development of that, but it was a year-long effort at public and health professionals to build awareness of DES-related health problems. And I have to tell you that the CDC was terribly disappointed. They thought what they did for the public was pretty good. They had never met such resistance from health professionals around any health subject as they did with DES. And I would say that certainly has been our experience around that individually and personally, but it was a surprising thing for the CDC to find that that's what happened to them too. Next slide. On the 30th anniversary of DES Action, our DES Action's co-founder and a DES mother, Pat Cody, had written DES Voices from Anger to Action, which tells the story of DES Action and our development. And next slide. And in 2014 was the 40th anniversary of the Herbst article. And so we prepared questions and participated in a video interview with Dr. Herbst. Great fun. And sobering, and to hear how it was for him to work with those first patients. And in October of that year, also the 40th anniversary of the link, the Herbst link, the DES follow-up study headed at lead writer in that, Hoover, printed a list of 12 adverse health effects linked to DES daughters. And I have quickly, and I don't know if you have it, but we quickly, next slide, that shows some of the times, the table times of how much more frequent those 12 issues are among DES daughters than unexposed people.